King Charles just blocked a major government bill and Keir Starmer walked out of Buckingham Palace in fury. This isn't constitutional procedure. This isn't polite disagreement. This is a direct collision between the Crown and the elected government, and it just exploded into public view. The King exercised his royal prerogative to refuse assent to legislation that Parliament passed, and the Prime Minister is reportedly livid. Witnesses say Starmer left the palace meeting abruptly, his face showing barely controlled anger, refusing to answer questions from waiting media. The constitutional crisis everyone feared is now happening in real time. The monarch has blocked the government, the Prime Minister has walked out. And Britain is about to be torn apart by a fight over who really has the power to govern this country. The details are still emerging, but here's what we know happened in the last hour. A major piece of government legislation, a bill that passed through both houses of Parliament with Labour's majority, was sent to Buckingham Palace for royal assent. This is normally a formality, a rubber stamp process where the monarch signs off on laws that Parliament has approved. But King Charles didn't give his assent. He refused. He exercised a power that exists on paper but hasn't been used in centuries, the royal prerogative to withhold consent from legislation. And he did it to one of Starmer's flagship bills, a centrepiece of the government's legislative agenda. The constitutional earthquake this creates cannot be overstated. The King has directly blocked an elected government from implementing its policy, and the Prime Minister is absolutely furious. Starmer was summoned to Buckingham Palace for an emergency meeting with the King. The purpose was supposedly to discuss the bill and the reasons for withholding assent. But according to sources close to the situation, the meeting went disastrously. Starmer arrived expecting to negotiate, to find some compromise that would allow the legislation to proceed. Instead, he was presented with a fait accompli. The King had made his decision. The reasons were constitutional concerns about the bill's impact on fundamental British institutions. And there would be no assent given unless the government withdrew the bill and started over. Starmer reportedly argued forcefully that the King had no right to override the will of Parliament, that this was an assault on democratic governance, and that the government would not back down. The King, according to the same sources, remained firm. The meeting ended badly. The image of Starmer walking out of Buckingham Palace is already iconic and deeply symbolic. Photographers captured him leaving through the palace gates, his expression thunderous, ignoring the shouted questions from journalists who sensed something major had happened. His car sped away without the usual brief statement or acknowledgement. The palace has released only the most minimal statement confirming that royal assent has been withheld pending further consultation. But that clinical language masks the reality of what just occurred. The British Constitution, that delicate unwritten arrangement between Crown and Parliament, has just been tested to breaking point. And nobody knows what happens next. That the specific bill that's been blocked is significant, which makes this confrontation even more explosive. This wasn't minor technical legislation that few people care about. This was a major reform bill that the Labour government had campaigned on, that represented core party policy, and that Starmer had invested significant political capital in passing. The exact nature of the bill is complex, but it involves changes to constitutional arrangements, the balance of powers between different branches of government, and reforms that the King apparently believes threaten the constitutional order. From Starmer's perspective, these are legitimate democratic reforms that an elected government has every right to implement. From the King's perspective, these are dangerous changes that violate constitutional principles he's sworn to protect. The constitutional experts are already weighing in, and they're divided. Some argue that the King is technically within his rights, that the royal prerogative to withhold assent exists precisely for situations where legislation threatens fundamental constitutional principles. They point to the monarch's role as guardian of the Constitution, someone who stands above party politics and can intervene when democracy itself is at risk. Others are arguing the exact opposite, that withholding royal assent in the modern era is unthinkable, that it violates every democratic norm Britain has developed over centuries, and that an unelected monarch blocking an elected government's legislation is the definition of unconstitutional overreach. Both sides are claiming constitutional legitimacy, which is the hallmark of a genuine constitutional crisis. The immediate political fallout is chaotic and intensifying by the minute. Labour MPs are expressing outrage at what they're calling a monarchical coup against democracy. They're demanding that the king reverse his decision immediately or face consequences that some are hinting could include moves to strip away royal powers or even abolish the monarchy entirely. The language being used is inflammatory and unprecedented. MPs who've spent their careers carefully respecting constitutional conventions are now openly questioning whether Britain should continue to have a monarch with any political power whatsoever. The anger is genuine and deep, reflecting a belief that the king has crossed a line that should never be crossed. Opposition parties are in a more complicated position. The Conservatives are traditionally monarchist and supportive of royal prerogatives, but they also opposed the bill that's been blocked. Some Tories are quietly pleased that the legislation has been stopped, even if they're uncomfortable with how it happened. But they're being careful in their public statements, knowing that openly supporting the king against an elected government looks anti-democratic. Nigel Farage and Reform UK are characteristically blunt, praising the king for standing up to what they call Labour's constitutional vandalism. Farage is arguing that this proves the value of having a monarch who can check governmental overreach, and he's positioning himself as defending both the king and the constitution against Labour's radical agenda. The markets are reacting with alarm to this constitutional confrontation. Currency traders don't know how to price political risk when the king and prime minister are in open conflict. The pound is dropping as investors flee uncertainty. Stock markets are volatile as traders try to assess what this means for governmental stability and policy predictability. International investors are watching in disbelief as Britain, supposedly a model of constitutional stability, descends into a crisis about fundamental governance. The economic cost of this confrontation is already mounting, and it's only been hours since the news broke. Every moment this conflict continues without resolution is another moment of damage to Britain's economic credibility. The public reaction is forming along predictable lines, but with surprising intensity. Monarchists are rallying to the king's defence, arguing he's doing his constitutional duty. Republicans are using this as proof that the monarchy is incompatible with democracy. Labour supporters are furious at what they see as their electoral victory being stolen by an unelected king. Conservative supporters are divided between their traditional monarchism and their distrust of royal interference. The country is splitting along multiple fault lines simultaneously, and social media is absolutely exploding with arguments about monarchy, democracy, constitutional law, and who really has the right to govern Britain. The palace is maintaining a carefully controlled public posture, but behind the scenes, there must be intense activity. King Charles has just taken the most politically controversial action by a British monarch in living memory. He's broken with decades of precedent where the Crown stays out of political disputes and defers to Parliament on legislative matters. The decision to withhold assent couldn't have been made lightly. It suggests either very strong constitutional concerns about the bill's content or a fundamental disagreement with the Starmer government's direction. Either way, the king has now made himself a political actor in ways that put the monarchy itself at risk. If this goes badly, if public opinion turns against him, it could reignite serious Republican sentiment and threaten the institution he's supposed to protect. The legal community is scrambling to analyse the precedents and implications. The last time royal assent was withheld from a bill that had passed Parliament was over 300 years ago, in a completely different constitutional context. Modern constitutional law has evolved on the assumption that this power would never actually be used. Court cases, legal textbooks, constitutional conventions, all of them are based on the idea that royal assent is automatic once Parliament approves legislation. Now, that assumption has been shattered, and legal experts are trying to figure out what the rules actually are. Can Parliament force the king to give assent? Can the government take the monarch to court? Can new legislation be passed stripping away this royal power? Nobody knows for certain because the situation is so unprecedented. Inside the Labour Party, there's emergency crisis management happening at every level. Senior ministers are being called into urgent meetings. The cabinet is convening to discuss how to respond. MPs are being briefed and asked to show unity in the face of what's being framed as a constitutional assault on democratic governance. But there are also reported divisions. Some Labour figures are questioning whether the bill was worth this fight, whether pushing constitutional reforms that the King found objectionable was wise strategy. Others are doubling down, arguing that backing down now would be capitulation to unelected power and would set a terrible precedent. Starmer is caught between these factions while also dealing with his own fury at being publicly humiliated by the monarch. The question of what Starmer does next is absolutely critical. He has several options, all of them risky. Option one is to escalate, to go to the country with a message that the King is blocking democracy and that the people need to choose between elected government and monarchical power. This could work if public opinion backs Parliament over the Crown, but it's a huge gamble that could backfire if people side with the King. Option two is to back down, withdraw the bill, and try to salvage the relationship with the palace. This would be politically devastating, making Starmer look weak and showing that the monarch can veto Labour's agenda. Option three is to find some compromise, modify the bill to address the King's concerns while preserving its core intent. But after walking out of that palace meeting, compromise looks difficult and might be seen as weakness anyway. The international dimension of this crisis is significant. Britain's closest allies are watching nervously as a constitutional crisis unfolds in real time. The United States, traditionally comfortable with Britain's constitutional monarchy, is now seeing that arrangement produce genuine governmental instability. European democracies, many with their own monarchies, are analysing whether this could happen in their systems too. Commonwealth nations where King Charles is also head of state are reassessing what it means to have this particular monarch in that role. The crisis is damaging Britain's international reputation and raising questions about whether constitutional monarchy is compatible with modern democratic governance. The media coverage is wall-to-wall and intensely divided along partisan lines. Left-leaning outlets are portraying this as monarchical overreach and an assault on democracy. They're running stories about the history of royal power being curtailed by Parliament, arguing this is a throwback to discredited ideas about divine right and absolute monarchy. Right-leaning outlets are more sympathetic to the King, framing this as a necessary check on governmental radicalism and praising his willingness to stand up for constitutional principles. The broadcast media is trying to maintain balance but struggling because the situation is so polarising. Every interview, every panel discussion, every news segment is featuring fierce arguments about who's right and what should happen next. Social media has become a complete battleground. Hashtags supporting and opposing the King are both trending simultaneously. Video clips of Starmer leaving the palace are being shared millions of times with competing narratives about what they show. Constitutional lawyers are posting long threads explaining the legal issues, which are then being argued over by people with no legal training but very strong opinions. Misinformation is spreading rapidly with false claims about what the bill actually contained, what the King actually said, and what happens next. The digital public square is as divided and angry as the physical political system. The upcoming parliamentary session is going to be absolutely explosive. MPs will demand statements, ask urgent questions, and force debates about this crisis. Starmer will need to explain what happened, justify his actions, and outline how the government responds. The opposition will use this to attack from multiple angles, some criticising the bill itself, others questioning Starmer's handling of relations with the palace, still others using the chaos to argue for elections. The chamber will be packed, the atmosphere will be electric, and whatever Starmer says will be picked apart and analysed endlessly. His performance in Parliament could determine whether he survives this crisis or whether it brings down his government. The constitutional scholars are providing historical context that makes this crisis even more significant. The principle that Parliament is sovereign, that the elected legislature has ultimate authority to make laws, has been established through centuries of constitutional development. The English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the gradual restriction of royal powers, all of this history points toward parliamentary supremacy. King Charles withholding assent represents a direct challenge to that principle. He's asserting that there are limits to what Parliament can do, that constitutional fundamentals exist beyond democratic majorities, and that the monarch has authority to enforce those limits. This is a coherent constitutional position, but it's one that Britain thought it had moved past centuries ago. The question of public opinion is crucial because ultimately that will determine how this resolves. If the British people overwhelmingly back Parliament against the King, the pressure on Charles to back down becomes irresistible. If they side with the King, Starmer's position becomes untenable. Early polling is showing a divided country, which is perhaps the worst outcome because it means there's no clear democratic mandate for either position. Younger voters tend to be more Republican and more supportive of Parliament. Older voters are more monarchist and more likely to trust the King's judgment. The geographic, generational and political divisions that already exist in British society are all being activated and amplified by this crisis. Inside Buckingham Palace, there must be serious concern about the institution's future. The monarchy has survived and thrived in the modern era precisely because it stayed out of political fights and maintained broad public support. King Charles has now abandoned that strategy, betting that the British people will support him taking a stand on constitutional principles. If he's wrong, if this backfires and generates serious Republican momentum, he'll have damaged the institution he's supposed to protect. The palace advisors who counselled him through this decision are either very confident in their constitutional analysis or are guilty of catastrophic misjudgment. Time will tell which. The economic uncertainty this creates extends beyond market volatility. Major governmental decisions are now on hold because nobody knows who actually has the power to make them. If the King can block legislation, what else can he block? Can he withhold assent from budget bills, from international treaties, from any policy he disagrees with? The predictability that businesses need to make investment decisions has been destroyed. The rule of law depends on knowing what the rules are, and right now nobody knows what constitutional rules Britain is actually operating under. This uncertainty has real costs in terms of delayed projects, postponed investments, and economic activity that doesn't happen because the political situation is too unstable. The opposition's strategy is becoming clearer as they have time to formulate responses. The Conservatives are trying to walk a careful line supporting the general principle that constitutional limits exist while not fully endorsing the specific action the King took. They're calling for calm, for dialogue, for finding a constitutional solution that respects both Parliament's authority and the monarch's role. It's a measured approach designed to look statesmanlike, but it also risks satisfying nobody. Reform UK is going much harder, openly praising the King and attacking Labour's bill as dangerous radicalism. Farage is positioning this as a fight between traditional British values and progressive extremism, and he's using it to build support for his party. The cabinet is reportedly divided on how to respond. Some ministers are urging confrontation, arguing that the government must stand firm on parliamentary sovereignty and cannot allow an unelected monarch to veto their agenda. Others are counselling caution, worried that escalating this fight could bring down the government and trigger elections Labour might not win. The Attorney General is being asked for legal advice on options ranging from court challenges to new legislation, stripping away royal prerogatives. Every option has risks, and Starmer is trying to navigate between competing factions within his own government while also managing the public crisis. The international constitutional comparisons are instructive. Other countries with constitutional monarchies are studying this crisis to understand what it means for their own systems. Some have more clearly defined limits on royal power written into constitutions. Others, like Britain, rely on conventions and understandings that have never been seriously tested. The lesson many are drawing is that unwritten constitutions are dangerous precisely because these kinds of ambiguities can emerge. When push comes to shove, when monarch and government genuinely disagree, having clear written rules about who prevails becomes crucial. Britain doesn't have those clear rules, which is why this crisis is so difficult to resolve. The role of the media in shaping public opinion on this issue cannot be overstated. How journalists frame this story, which facts they emphasise, which experts they quote, all of it influences how millions of people understand what's happening.